On a hot summer night in 1988, Jane Borowski was stabbed 27 times by an unknown man. She was 7 months pregnant.
My name is Jane Borowski. I survived, and I remember everything.
Jane is the lone survivor of a serial killer. I'm your host, Jennifer Amell, and this is Dark Valley. Join us in our search for America's unknown serial killer. Subscribe to Dark Valley. Out now.
Slow Burn Media and Evergreen Podcast presents Who Killed, a podcast that provides a voice for the voiceless.
Attorneys independent of the Delphi criminal case filed a petition with the Indiana Supreme Court against Special Judge Francis Gull from Allen County for a writ of mandamus and prohibition. That's a legal term that asks for the high court to order a lower court to follow the rules or correct mistakes. The petition argues court records sealed in this case should be made public. The state's highest court has set a November 9th deadline for interested parties to weigh in. On Tuesday, Judge Gull refused to let Andrew Baldwin and Bradley Rosie continue as Richard Allen's attorneys. She said they engaged in gross negligence. They said that's the court's opinion. I spoke with longtime defense attorney Ben Jaffe.
There hasn't been a clear showing that there is some gross negligence, and even if there was, does it warrant the removal, or does that give the court an actual authority to remove them? Those are still unanswered questions.
A hearing is happening right now for Brian Kohberger, the man accused of stabbing 4 University of Idaho students to death last November. Kohberger's lawyers now want to know exactly how investigators were able to gather Kohberger's DNA that they say placed him at the scene of the crime. Investigators used a process called investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG, to collect DNA from another source and ultimately match it to the DNA on a knife sheath found at the crime scene near the bodies of 2 of the victims, Kaylee Gonzalez and Madison Mogan. This DNA match is possibly the prosecutor's strongest piece of evidence against Kohberger. Kohberger's lawyers say they need the information to help prepare their defense. But the prosecution argues they didn't use IgG to obtain any warrants, and they're concerned unknown relatives' identities will be made public if the genetic genealogy gets out there. In his order last week, the judge stated to balance the interests of the defense and prosecution, he will review all of the IgG information the state and FBI have. He will then decide what does and does not need to be disclosed.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Who Killed. I am your host, Bill Huffman, and this is a Slow Burn Media, Evergreen Podcast, and Killer Podcast production. I am joined once again by the former Lawrence County prosecutor, Matt Mangino. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
Well, we're here to talk about a couple different cases, and they've been in the news this week, and I try to keep up to date on what's going on in a lot of these situations. And you are ever present on TV, ever present on social. You are all over the place. I see you commenting on everything. And you seem to be the resident expert, and you are the resident expert on this show when it comes to law because of your experience, obviously. And we met back at CrimeCon, I think. And,
yeah.
You know, it's just we've sort of formed this nice little friendship where we're able to discuss these cases where I kind of get lost in the details. And I think it's important for the listeners to understand what is going on. So if you could give me a little bit of background, like what exactly is happening with the current situation in Delphi?
Yeah. Well, yeah. First, Bill, I just want to say it's always a pleasure to be on with you. I love what you do. I follow what you do. It's great work, and so really, it's a privilege for me to get a chance to chat with you every once in a while.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
You know, this Delphi case could not be stranger. I mean, it's really evolved into this sort of sinister leak and everything that goes along with that, and then the defense team resigns, and then they want to come back, and then the judge says no. It's really it reads like a crime novel. Some of this stuff, if you were reading about it, you'd say, that can't happen. But in fact, it does. So first of all, we have this leak, and we learned that the leak may have been the responsibility of an employee of one of the defense attorneys who surreptitiously went in and took some uh, photographs of the crime scene and other pieces of evidence, and then that was turned over to somebody else, and then ultimately it got into the hands of someone who had the ability to sort of publish that in a public way. Then we learned that one of the persons involved in these transactions uh, committed suicide. So it really gets more and more bizarre. The defense team says, "Hey, here's what happened." We see an exchange of emails between the defense and the prosecution, and ultimately it's brought before the court. And the one attorney whose employee was possibly involved removes himself from the case. Then the co-counsel removes himself from the case. Then they come back and say the judge coerced them, and they don't want to leave the case. And the judge says, "No, you're not coming back. I've already appointed alternative counsel." I mean, that's some really skullduggery kind of stuff in terms of what's happened here.
Yeah, I mean, it really is something that I have, been keeping a close eye on because obviously I've met Kelsey and I know that the case has been very important to the community and really just the whole country has really been focused on this stuff. And to have such a breach of, I guess, confidentiality, like, you, it's just all, like you said, it's playing out like a movie, and it's stuff that you probably couldn't even write because people would think it was ridiculous. Like, this wouldn't happen in real life. And there is so much stuff that goes on. I mean, this isn't even including the fact that it took a number of years to even apprehend this suspect, where they had found a bullet that had been chambered through his gun. There's certain things about this case that just drive me nuts because it feels like they could have just done a little bit more research or a little bit more investigation of this guy, and they may have been able to reel him in a little bit quicker than what they did. And do you feel like that was one of the things that surprised you about how long it took them to get this guy? And then when they did get him, they released what it was that put him there, two and two together?
I mean, Bill, as you know, so many people are interested in these cases, this whole, true crime kind of mania that's out there. And as you said, we met at Crime Con, and I mean, there are people who are genuinely interested in this, and people who, in some instances, are able to assist law enforcement in finding certain pieces of evidence or finding people who are of interest to law enforcement. It's tough to second guess investigators. To be sort of a Monday morning quarterback,
It's
but
unfair.
yeah, but because there's so much that goes into these cases, and while investigators focus a lot of attention on cases like this, and rightfully so. You have two murders, children, but the issue uh, is that sometimes that's not the only case they're working on. So things move slowly, and you're waiting for some scientific analysis. You're waiting for other things that slow the process down. And I'd like to think that investigators want to be as meticulous as possible. They don't want to charge people who are innocent. They don't want to go through the process of screwing something up that would blow a prosecution. So, I sometimes think that we expect things to happen very quickly because in the public, what we see is a 60-minute television show in which a crime occurs, an investigation occurs, a suspect's arrested, and successfully prosecuted.
Are you telling me
Obviously,
Law and Order is not realistic?
it's not real. I hate to
Oh,
break the news to you, and even the other cases that we see, on other television programs that are real life cases, they're still resolved in an hour. Although it took years to do it, you get this sense that this stuff can happen very quickly, and with all deference to the police, it doesn't. And prosecutors want to put the best possible case they can put on, even if it does involve a little extra time.
sure. And I know in like previous cases where, Jacob Wetterling, he was abducted in 1989, this a week before Amy Mahalovic. And I remember in one of the podcasts with his mother, they were talking about the police and the tips, and they just had so many tips. And it's like, I remember sitting down with the police chief about Amy's case and asking him, do you feel like you had too many tips? And he's like, well, it's kind of a silly question if you think about it, because if you don't follow up on all those tips, you may miss the one that is there. But you also see how it can happen. It's not that they don't investigate the tips. It may be that they just don't investigate them to the degree that they may another one, or they just might not have the workforce or the manpower to conduct these sort of deep investigations, especially one where you have two murdered children. That is really something that traumatized a community, and it's a rural area. They don't have a lot of resources. I can't blame them, but it just was a weird thing that stood out to me as far as having the actual bullet and knowing that it was something that this guy had owned. Or it's all been fishy. And in your years of prosecuting, have you ever seen lawyers act the way that these lawyers have been acting in Richard Allen's defense?
Well, this is those circumstances, I would say, are unique. I mean, I'd like to say, I was an elected prosecutor for 8 years, overseeing an office in a smaller, more rural county right north of Pittsburgh, and you just these things don't happen all the time. And you have a high profile case. Obviously, there's a lot of people in the community and across the country who want to hear more about this. And somebody sees, oh, there's an opportunity. I can maybe make some money, take these photographs. What's the big deal, and sell them. And it just spins out of control. And now all of a sudden, defense counsel is indirectly involved in this, and all of a sudden they're gone. So yeah, I mean, I'd like to say, hey, Bill, let me tell you about the time that blah 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 happened, but I don't got one of those stories. This is a very unique and strange development in this case. So and it just makes the case even more interesting to the public. So all of a sudden now you're saying, well, look at what happened here. This is a little shady, and well, why did this happen? Maybe that's shady too, and why did it take so long? That it breeds that kind of conspiracy sort of theory that, as you see this case sort of go in a bunch of different directions, maybe the whole case is bad.
Well, that's an interesting perspective to have. And what do you make of some of the claims that the lawyers made about, they didn't investigate a potential cult and this was some sort of ritual killing? And again, something right out of a movie. What do you make of that?
Well, listen, defense attorneys have a responsibility to zealously represent their clients. Okay, and so what happens is we hear about these things in pretrial motions, and a lot of this stuff, may never and probably won't ever reach a jury who's going to try this case. But we hear about it outside of the courtroom because these hearings are open to the public, and they should be, and you hear all these different ideas that are floated around. And like I said, I mean, the defense has a responsibility to explore all those things. I don't think that issue is going to get any traction, and is ultimately going to be something that a jury has to decide whether or not this was a cult sacrifice, or something like that. But it makes for interesting reading, and it makes for interesting coverage, and it's sort of sensationalized as the process, and that's what gets the public's attention sometimes. But you don't try these cases in pretrial motions, and you don't try these cases in front of the media. Ultimately, you try them in front of a jury.
And speaking of a jury, do you feel like this is some sort of tactic by the defense to somewhat taint the jury pool?
Well, I don't know that it's necessarily a tactic, but the more and more information that comes out about this case, and the more news that it generates, and the more social media buzz that it generates, it's going to make picking a jury in that county difficult. Now, the other thing is, and this is what always I find kind of ironic and funny, is that much of what we hear about these cases is not necessarily the local newspaper writing about it, or even local television covering it, although there's certainly coverage like that. But a lot of it is cable news, which everybody across the country can watch, and people who are interested in true crime, who tune into your program, they see it. Okay, so somebody sitting in Pennsylvania, and there are a lot of them who are looking at this Delphi case and saying, "Wow, what about this? What about that?" I mean, you might have a tough time coming to Pennsylvania and finding a jury who hasn't heard anything about this case. But that's the issue, Bill, and that's what a lot of people that's a misconception about the jury selection process. It doesn't matter if you've heard about a case, because a lot of people are going to hear about cases, and they're going to read about them in the newspaper. The issue is, have you already drawn some conclusion about the case? And has what you heard made you unable to be a fair and just juror in this case? Most people will tell you, no, yeah, I've read about it, but I haven't made any conclusions, and I can still be fair and impartial in this case. And that means you can't eliminate that juror for cause, because they're telling you, hey, yeah, I've heard about it, but I can still be fair and impartial. And that's the distinction. So yeah, there's a lot of publicity around this case. Doesn't mean you can't pick a jury. Doesn't mean you can't find a room full of jurors to pick from who say, hey, I can be fair and impartial. I haven't made any conclusion about this.
Yeah, I guess it's really not like it was back in the day, where you didn't have that 24/7 news cycle, where it is constantly being broadcast throughout the country. And you have social media, obviously, as a driving force too. And it is something that I think is something we have to deal with going forward. People in law, people in your position, people in judges and whatnot. Those are all elements that, again, weren't something that even was a factor 30 years ago, 25 years ago, before the Gen Z. I mean, every kid's been born with the internet. We didn't have any of that stuff when we were kids. We had to go to the library. Like, that was the way it was.
Right.
To think that you would know about a case in Delphi, Indiana, 50 years ago, the chances are zero.
Right.
And maybe
as a side note, Bill, that's what's interesting about really what's going on in society right now. So those of us like you and I who follow crime rates and those kind of things, because we're interested in that stuff. We know that crime rates are again falling. Murder rates are falling in this country, and yet people are at this heightened fear of crime. fear of crime in major cities, and most major cities are seeing a reduction in it. And really, what can you attribute it to other than that's all you see? I mean, the nightly news, is if it bleeds, it leads.
Let's not, let's bring up the movie Network. I mean, they
Yeah.
pretty much the death hour, like literally that's what the nightly news became. It was a farce, but now it's reality.
Right. And so people, all these different programs that you can watch, podcasts that you can watch that talk about cases, and even I do a lot with Law and Crime Network and Court TV, and you're seeing these trials, and you're seeing, and of course they're all terrible, heinous crimes.
Yeah.
So certainly you're sitting in your living room in Pennsylvania or in Indiana or in Colorado, and you're thinking crime is rampant. I mean, I got to get bars on my window. I mean, I got to sleep with a gun under my pillow, and really, it's distorted. It's a distorted perception of what's actually happened.
Yes, I 100% agree with that. And I've been following that for years as far as the way people perceive our country or perceive our cities as some sort of like cesspool of people getting mugged and murdered all the time in just broad daylight. I mean, things were way worse in the 80s, way worse in the 70s.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there was, just the violence alone on the street was prevalent. Now it's like you can go walk around New York City and not have to think anything about getting into any trouble. Like,
Right.
certainly don't go to certain areas, but hey, even in this day and age where they just put up the most heinous stuff on television because that's what's sensational, the truth of the matter lies in the statistics, and the statistics are the fact that you're going to get abducted or that if you would be abducted are so low, and the amount of parents that are freaked out over their children. And it seems to me as if it sort of sets the children back a few years by being so helicoptered and just being so constantly, the gun. What do they call them in school? The shooter. Gosh, I'm gonna have to. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
The mass shooting events, and like instead of like tornado drills that I went through and fire drills, which I'm sure they still do, but to think about how much that traumatizes a child. I mean, I remember watching the nightly news, and it was the local news, but like it would get to the point where my parents would just flip the channel off because it was so bad.
Right.
And that would be a little traumatizing. And nowadays, again, like you said, people are sitting around watching it as entertainment, and people like me have TV or podcasts about it. And it is feeding into the culture, but it is also, I try to separate myself in one way, and that is try to focus a little bit more on some of the other cases that aren't as well known. And even that's hard because the news didn't cover them very well because they weren't, they were drug users or they were sex workers. And again, it doesn't matter. It's still a life. And as a prosecutor, you still have to prosecute that case. It doesn't matter what they did.
Yeah. I mean, there's no question that you don't get to pick and choose the cases that you're going to prosecute necessarily. I mean, and you have that responsibility to the community. You have that responsibility to the victims, which prosecutors certainly take very serious. I just think the unfortunate thing is that we kind of have a warped lens as to what reality is and what the way reality is depicted in television, newspaper, other media outlets.
Yeah, they call it clickbait for a reason, and it is definitely something that works. I worked in television news. I know what they put on the news, and it's a bunch of crap, but get into the whole local news thing, but it's just, there are some subjects that local news should cover, and there's some subjects national news should cover, and then there are other things that they just don't need to exploit, because it gets down to the point of exploitation. And whereas I feel like in the Idaho case, you had 4 people, white college kids, 3 women, very, very pretty girls, living that life. And they're taken out by this individual they have in custody, Brian Kohberger. And he's currently sitting in jail. And today the judge just dismissed the attempt to dismiss the case by the defense. So another tactic of defense delay. And how are you following the Idaho case?
Yeah, I mean, it too is an interesting, kind of an extraordinary case that has touched so many people around the country. And you bring up this issue, and not to be redundant, but again, I think defense attorneys, have to zealously represent. Sometimes they have to go over the top. I mean, here, they're asking that the grand jury instructions were inappropriate, and therefore the indictment from the grand jury was inappropriate. And even at the time they presented it, the judge kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, "Well, I mean, these have been around for 100 years. These are the instructions we use. I mean, why is it different for your client?" And ultimately, dismissing that claim. And I'm sure defense counsel knew from the get-go that there was little or no chance that was going to be, accepted by the judge or granted by the judge. But you present it, you make a record, maybe, on appellate review, there's some way that you could use this. But I think what we're seeing here is the defense sort of coming to the conclusion that, hey, this case isn't going to be tried in October, and ultimately they waived now the speedy trial rule, and now we're looking at trial next October in this case, which is more realistic.
So we're going to have Delphi and Idaho in the same month next year.
Yeah, that's going to make the court TV and
you're going to be working 24/7.
Yeah, they're going to have to go on double shifts. But yeah, so I mean, it's unrealistic even for a defendant. I mean, let's go back 100 years, or longer, and you got arrested, at the first of the month, and you were picking a jury by the end of the month. Speedy trial meant speedy trial. Okay. But we know now, especially in a high-profile case like this, with so much analysis of evidence and things like that, and the telephone, the cell phone calls,
the genetic genealogy,
the DNA through the genealogy that you talk about. I mean, so much. I mean, you can't be ready and do a competent job for your client really within the speedy trial rules. It's virtually impossible. So you're trading one for the other. Okay, we're going to push the prosecution because we want this case to go as quickly as possible. Maybe they won't be entirely ready, but guess what? You won't be ready as a defense. And so it's sort of self-defeating. So on the one hand, maybe they're not ready, but on the other hand, well, maybe you're ineffective because you haven't been able to do the kind of work that you need to do to prepare the case.
That's an interesting perspective, and I totally respect that perspective too, coming from you. It's one of those things where, you kind of have to throw all that stuff out the window nowadays when it comes down to all of the scientific analysis, all the triangulation of cell tower pings, and what does that mean, and how did they find his DNA, and what did they do to connect all these things? And it does make it a much more, it's just a heavy burden to go through. And you have all these files and these tips and this scientific evidence, and so you have to get your experts lined up. You have to, and I see what you're saying about the defense, and you're saying about what you're saying also about the prosecutor. You don't want to go into a case like this unprepared. I mean, you want to talk about an O.J. Simpson style situation where it's just, I mean, of course that case is an outlier, but what I'm saying is there was just some mistakes made on the prosecutorial side in that case that may have not been done if they wouldn't. Again, all these cases that get thrown in the media, they kind of are a wild card, I think, because the way that the media can twist anything nowadays. Yeah. It doesn't matter if you're listening or you're reading the New York Times or the LA Times or the Denver Gazette or whatever you're reading, you're going to get a different sort of opinion. And where back in the day, journalism was just writing about the facts, who, what, where, when, and why. And now it's become much more of just a sentence here and a sentence there can sway some sort of opinion one way or the other. And I can't even fathom what it would be like to have to go through all of these files, to have to go through all these witness testimonies, to re-interview these witnesses. So, I mean, to think even like October 2024, that's still like they're going to be working all the way up until October 2024. Like they're going to be busting their ass because it's not like this is information in both cases that is easy to analyze. It's not a purse snatching. It's not a bank robbery. It's not like, I mean, I guess my question would be, if it was a bank robbery, would it be a easier trial to have? Like, is that, or is it just become so bogged down in this stuff that the idea of a speedy trial in any case is just sort of ridiculous?
Yeah. Well, I think, what you have to take into consideration in these trials is a number of things. I mean, normally, the great cases for prosecutors end up in pleas. All right, because when the evidence is stacked up and there's nothing out there, somebody's pleading guilty. Okay, so typically cases that get tried are usually not the prosecution's best case, unless they've taken a really hard line position where they say, listen, we're not offering you a plea bargain. So for instance, last fall, I tried a first degree murder case in Western Pennsylvania because the prosecution never offered me anything. They said, your guy can plead to life in prison. If he wants life in prison, he can plead. Well, I said, if he goes to trial, he's going to get life in prison. So we're going to roll the dice. And it ended up that we ended up with a lesser conviction than first degree murder. So my guy has some light at the end of the tunnel. It's not life in prison, but it's only those types of cases that get tried. And then the second thing is, if you're really going to try a case the way it's supposed to, you have to have the resources to do it. Okay. So if you're going to hire private counsel and you're going to hire expert witnesses and you're going to do DNA analysis and you're going to do the telephone ping analysis and you're going to do video analysis and all these sort of things, you got to have resources to do that. And unfortunately, 99% of people who are charged with a crime don't have those resources. Okay, so public defenders, they do a great job. I mean, the only drawback for a public defender is that they're overworked. They're certainly not because they're incompetent, because they spend all of their time doing criminal cases and they know what they're doing. They just don't have the resources to do the kind of things that they'd like to, or the time to focus on it. So when we think about these cases, we're looking at a very limited number of cases. Very few cases get tried. And those cases, a large number of them, are not the best case for the prosecution, or they would have gotten a plea. So you're working with a dynamic here that you have resourceful defendants in bad cases, and they make for really sensational trials.
That is another interesting perspective. I think a lot of people don't know that about cases. And it does make you wonder, in a case like Richard Allen or Brian Koberger, where these cases, do the prosecutors just say, no, we're not doing anything? And because it's so heinous, I get both of the, if that's the case, I get it. But what is the percentage? I mean, we're talking like single digits that go to trial, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, on a federal level, I mean, it's at like 97% of cases end up in pleas. State court, where, a significant majority of criminal charges are filed, it's at like 95%. So only one, literally 1 in 20 cases is being tried. And most of those cases, again, aren't cases, with private counsel, with expert witnesses, with all, it might be somebody who has a high number of prior convictions. So they know if they get convicted, they're going away for a long time. So they figure, I'm just going to roll the dice and see what happens. Um, you know, Otherwise, you know, 95% of criminal cases end up in pleas.
Okay. And I knew the number was high, and it just makes me wonder, like, as on the federal level, they generally don't take a case or bring a case unless they've got evidence.
They get the cherry pick on the federal level.
Yeah. So they basically know that they've got their guy pretty much if they indict you or whatever. And I guess basically on the local level, it's the same thing. With that being said, with only 1 out of 20 cases going to court, and these, pro bono, not pro bono, but, court appointed attorneys, how are they able to afford any of this analysis that is out there? Because again, like you said, it costs tons of money to do a really deep analysis on certain things.
Yeah. So most public defenders' offices will have a budget, and that budget will be limited. They'll have a line item in there for expert witnesses, but they have to be very prudent about how they spend that money and what cases they use that money on. Now, of course, you can go back to your county commissioners or your county supervisor and say, "Well, I'd like more money to try to get people from going to prison." And as you can imagine, when you go to a public meeting and you ask a county commissioner, "Can you give me more money so I can try to get guys accused of crimes off?" That usually doesn't go very well, and you usually don't get that supplemental budget request. But the thing that really should be alarming about that whole process is, the cornerstone of the criminal justice system is that the state has to prove somebody guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay, that's a high threshold, and we take pride in that as a country, that we can't send somebody to prison unless you really meet that very high burden of proof. But when you think about it, if 95% of cases are ending up in a plea, we're not proving many people guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. In fact, what's happening is the case is being proven, probable cause is being established, that it's more likely than not that somebody committed a crime, and this is the guy that committed the crime. So now his case goes to court and he pleads guilty. Prosecution's never had to prove anything really more than probable cause, because he makes an admission in his guilty plea. So although that's such an important aspect of our criminal justice system, there are not many people being proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, does that mean that innocent people are pleading guilty? I don't think a lot of them are necessarily innocent, but some of them are. And I'll give you an example of how that happens. Okay. So let's say, you're a defendant and you have a long criminal history. Okay. So when they look at their sentence guidelines, you're way up there. Okay. Now you get arrested for a burglary, which is a felony. And when they look at your criminal history and this new felony, the range of your sentence might be 5 to 10 years. So you're looking at 5 to 10 years if you're convicted. Prosecutor comes along and says, you know what? This isn't a great case, but we'll offer you 1 to 2 years on a defiant trespass instead of a burglary. So now you have to sit there and say, well, do I want to go to trial where I could face 5 to 10 years? Or do I want to admit to something I didn't do? Now, this isn't the nicest guy in town. He has a history, but he didn't do this. He didn't commit this crime. But when he has to weigh, do I take 1 to 2 or possibly get 5 to 10? I'm going to take 1 to 2. I'm going to plead guilty to something I didn't do because I don't want to take the risk of a longer sentence. That happens. And it shouldn't, but it does. And so that's an example of when an innocent person pleads guilty because the system is built to make him shun that risk and take what's in front of him.
Yeah, that's having seen both sides of the fence for you, I can only imagine what your thoughts are on all this stuff. Clearly, you just laid it out pretty well on how you feel like the justice system is and isn't working. But wow, I'm still kind of blown away by the fact that the cases that do go to trial are the weakest of the cases. Now I get when people, it's just that still just blows my mind. Like,
right.
So it's like you're almost twisting the guy in the defense chair's arm until he says uncle. And
Right.
and it's like, is that fair? Or I'm kind of seeing both sides now, and it's really not black and white. It's really gray, and God, there's like a bunch of mud in the middle of this thing that really makes this stuff seem really not that great. And what do you want? Your final thought on that?
It's like the old saying that if you saw how sausage was made, you'd never want to eat sausage again. And kind of this is the sausage making process of the criminal justice system.
That's a good example. But boy, you don't realize how dirty it is behind the scenes until you talk to somebody who's been on both sides of the table, and it's just nuts to think that we will bring a case, spend countless amounts of dollars, tax dollars, on the weakest case that we have. Just seems weird.
Yeah.
But hey, everybody deserves their day in court. And then the other thing about the 1 in 20, it's like, how many court lawyers are used to being trial lawyers anymore? I mean, since it's being pled out so many times, where's the practice coming from?
That's a good question. And don't get me wrong, Bill. I mean, I think that our justice system is the best system in the world. I mean,
we weren't saying. I never thought that you were saying otherwise.
And I think it's very effective. It does keep that burden very high and that responsibility very high on the state to present their witnesses. And there are so many different ways established through constitutional law where individual rights are protected. But you're right. I mean, there has to be some other options available as well that will help us to determine guilt or innocence.
Yeah, it seems like a very slippery slope, and with all the people that are involved in these things nowadays, I definitely think it's going to be it's something that's going to be
sometimes you got to keep working too, Bill.
Yeah, sometimes work just does not stop. And on that note, what are your final thoughts on both these cases, and where can people find you? Because I know that you're an extremely busy man and literally just got the tap on the shoulder too.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that, Bill. I mean, I think, these cases, both Delphi and Kohlberger are going to churn out a lot more interesting information over the next year as we look forward to trials a year from now. So now that issue of the speedy trial rule is out of the way, and Koberger, I think we're going to see a lot of motions. We're going to see a lot of challenges to the evidence in this case. Delphi is going to have to sort out, Ellen, his defense team, who's it going to be? How's it going to work? Is he going to be satisfied with that, as well? But I'll be, as you will be, I'll be following those things, and I'll be covering them on my blog, which is at mattmangino.com, and I write every day. And then, I'm excited to say that I had just signed an agreement with Creators Syndicate, and I'm going to be writing a syndicated column on law and crime. So that's
congratulations.
So I'm really excited about that. That's going to debut after the first of the year. And, you can also follow me on Twitter at Matthew T. Mangino.
And let's not forget about your book.
And my book, don't forget about my book, The Executioner's Toll.
This is interesting.
2010, which was published a couple of years ago by McFarland Publishing. And what it does is it kind of chronicles all the death sentences and executions in 2010. Kind of an unbiased look at it, rather than cherry picking cases that are good or bad for your position. I thought, let's look at these 46 cases. Let's read about the crimes, the trials, the appeals, the executions, and then, you decide what you think of the death.
An excellent premise for a book, and very, very well done. So thank you again, Matt, for joining me today, and I will let you go on to your bigger and better things. But thank you for joining the Who Killed studio today and talking these cases.
Bill. It's been fun, and I always enjoy talking with you. It's always fascinating. So
and we'll catch up throughout this year as far as when they get closer to trial, and as things go on, we will definitely talk again. So thank you again, Matt.
All right.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in this week to a brand new episode of Who Killed, and many thanks to Matthew Mangino for joining me. He, again, is the former prosecuting attorney for Lawrence County outside of Newcastle, Pennsylvania, and he is frequently seen on the Law and Crime Network and Court TV. So he is definitely somebody that knows his way around the legal system, and that's why I wanted to have him on the show today to discuss some of these cases that I really get bogged down in the details. So it's nice to have somebody with a legal background explain some of these things a little bit more on the layman level. So hopefully you gain some knowledge on what's going on with these cases. Clearly, we aren't going to see any trials for 12 months, which is somewhat frustrating, but as we said in the episode, it is kind of impossible to have a speedy trial these days with all the amount of information that is out there. So again, check him out wherever you can find him. He is online. He is on Law and Crime Network and, again, Court TV. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can do so at BillHuffman3. And as always, I drop new episodes every Friday. And until next time, stay healthy and be safe.
Women's Running Stories, where we explore the intersection between running and life. Because every woman who is committed to a running journey has a story to tell, and this is where you'll find those stories. I am host and producer Cherie Louise Turner. I'm a 53-year-old runner, and together with original music by musician and runner Cormac O'Regan, we bring these inspirational stories to life. Please join us to fuel your adventures.
You might be surprised to know that not all serial killers are straight cisgender white men, and the victims of true crime are not a monolith either. She's Wendy and I'm Beth, and together we host Fruit Loops Serial Killers of Color, a true crime podcast.
Together we take deep dives into the true crime stories about marginalized and minoritized perps and victims that often go untold.
We also provide the context and nuance that these stories deserve. At Fruit Loops, we're serving up true crime with a side of history, society, culture, and some fun.
Listen to Fruit Loop Serial Killers of Color on Spotify, Google Play, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.